Hi, I'm Sebastian Clark Koth. I'm a researcher at the chair of Building Technology, Climate Responsive Design at the Technical University of Munich. And I'd love to talk a little bit about sustainability. I think that the terminology of sustainability is somewhat familiar. I feel like everyone's by now heard of climate change in the broadest sense. But when we think about what a sustainable future looks like, it becomes a little harder to grasp. I think the kind of real-time sustainable future development as the kind of broadest sense of actual impact on a municipal or local level is something that's harder to understand. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I think overall, in general, what we need to understand that ever since the kind of industrial age, we've, as humans, emitted more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere than nature can sink, right? And so we call that the kind of planetary boundaries. So that's the relationship of what we humans emit versus what the Earth's ecosystem can take in and sink and regenerate of those emissions or resources, right? And so if we emit more and more greenhouse gases that Earth can't take in, then what happens is that we have a greenhouse gas effect, so the Earth keeps heating up. And to avoid that, we kind of need to understand how can we live in a way that we don't exceed that threshold. The first time we kind of talked about this in a terminology of sustainable development was the Brundtland Report, 1987. And in that, Brundtland says that sustainable development is something where we meet our current needs without limiting the possibility of future needs, right? So the idea that we can't shift that responsibility of taking care of Earth to another future generation, right? And usually that is thought of in three dimensions. There's the economy, there's the social aspect, and then there's, above all, the kind of environmental toll of that. The economic sphere of sustainability in broadest senses would mean that we have some sort of processes, some sort of goals that ensure a long-term economic viability or maybe even growth without the kind of implication or negative impact on nature and society as all, right? The societal kind of sustainability would mean that we look at humans, try to understand what do humans need. So in the broadest sense, we kind of talk about human health in the built environment. But a lot of people nowadays use it to describe social justice, equality for marginalized people, but also to kind of understand this injustice in global differentiation between how much people suffer under the environmental toll of climate change. And then I think what I want to talk about a little bit is the kind of environmental aspect or the ecological dimension of sustainability. And that kind of describes, for example, that we as Germany use 3 times the resources that we actually have accessible to us, right? So we have an ecological footprint that is 3 times bigger than it can be. Meaning if everyone in the world lived as we did in Germany, then we would need 3 Earths to compensate the resource demand, the consumption, and the emissions that we put out into the world to compensate that, right? So we live beyond our, basically, planetary boundaries. Specifically, it's 3 sectors. It's the building sector that I'm going to talk about in a second, the infrastructure, and the energy sector, right? Those are the 3 big kind of main sectors responsible for this kind of high emission and high energy demand. The building sector alone is responsible for 40% of all CO2 emissions, 30% of all energy demand, 40% of all waste globally, right? So huge chunk of that is the building environment. So we really need to understand how we can decarbonize the building sector and the built environment in a way that is long-lasting and within the realms of the resources that we actually have available to us and not just also taking that away from future generations. There's 3 ways how we can do that. 3 ways how we can decarbonize built environments like cities. One is efficiency, the second is consistency, and the third is sufficiency. Efficiency would mean that we lower the input for the same output, right? So if we take the example of a car and we say we have a car that runs on 10 liters of gas for 100 kilometers range, and we replace that through a car that only uses 6 liters of gas for 100 kilometers. We have the same output, we have that same distance of 100 kilometers, but we're using less input, we're using less gas to actually make that, right? So that would be efficiency measures. And we have those a lot. We use those everywhere. Every technical device that we develop, every new innovation kind of has that advantage of being more efficient. Then there's consistency. Consistency describes basically kind of replacing the input source by something that's renewable. So in the case of the car, that would mean using an electric car that runs on electric power solely relied on kind of solar and wind power, right? So if the input is completely renewable, and we still have the same output, that would be a consistency measures, right? And that's what we do on a municipality level, on a city level everywhere, right? We start building photovoltaic, we start building wind parks. That's something of consistency, kind of trying to shift that energy sector into being renewable. The last one we don't really talk about often, that's sufficiency. And sufficiency is to kind of rethink if the output is actually what we want it to be, right? So maybe it's just me driving the car and I don't have any baggage with me. So maybe I don't actually need a car, right? Maybe my goal is just to get somewhere, but the goal doesn't have to be reached through the car. It doesn't necessarily have to be through car. For 100 kilometers, maybe. But maybe if I'm only going to work, then I could take the bike or the bus or walk. But that also means that our built environment needs to necessitate that, right? It needs to have some sort of incentive to give that we can actually take part in that sufficiency measure of kind of choosing the route that we want to go to achieve that goal. Often, like I said, in the past decades, every measure in decarbonizing the building sector has really kind of focused on efficiency and consistency measures. In the New European Bauhaus, we try to understand sufficiency as a measure of sustainability that's also really beautiful. That was like the first instance, I think, where we came in contact, and we really believe that this sufficiency strategy can be something where we completely rethink processes that we take for granted, right? And kind of disturb this all-time dragged along reminiscence of the industrial age. So specifically, maybe in the case of creating neighborhoods together, that meant that we looked for places and people, communities, or even processes, networks that understood, or where we could understand this as a kind of test bed to see the beauty of sufficiency play out, right? So as an example, maybe instead of just implementing PV, we had one action that created energy communities, right? So it's a larger network of understanding, of evaluating, but being fiscally responsible on a very local, low threshold realm to understand energy sufficiency, understand energy demand, but fluctuations also throughout the year, and the kind of understanding of the value of resources, right? It could also mean something like toolboxes of animal-aided design project, where we, on a, again, local level, take into account a network of actors in a neighborhood that can, through this understanding process of how to deal with certain ecological resources and values, create ideas out of that, right? Growing a tasty Neuperlach would be a project where we understand this ecological benefit of urban gardening on a very, very primal kind of level, right? But also public power or Pearl projects that with really low kind of and simple implications transform a space to be more usable, to be more inhabitable or walkable. So again, offering these very simple solutions for people then to really kind of, in a grassroots attempt, create something that has a value and pressure it to being something that is really valuable long-term and viable long-term, right? So I think what I'm trying to say, or where I'd like to end this in a sense, is the understanding of sustainability measures not just being a vehicle to advance technology, advance innovation in a way to being more efficient, or to merely replace same kind of systems with systems that do the same thing but are reliant on renewable energy. That alone is not the disturbance that we need and not the magnitude that we need to globally reduce emissions. What we need is an incentive of rethinking processes as we do right now and kind of come up with system and network understandings that can really foster new ideas on a local level that build up over time, but that also rely on instances, people, monetary values, or economic systems that are ingrained in the trust and understanding of the resources they use. So feel free to check out the projects because there's a lot more that understand this relationship on a very simple built environment neighborhood level, as well as the kind of upper municipality level. Thank you.